Speaking question 6. Speaking skill 16. Example question 6. Listening passage A. Page 300. Listen to part of a lecture in a Western civilization class.
The Persian Empire of the 5th and 6th century BCE was the first that brought the Greek world into direct contact with an empire that included Egypt, Mesopotamia, and extended even as far as India. For the first time, with part of the Greek lands under Persian control, ideas and trade goods could spread more freely from the lands of the Near East to the Greek city-states. And these city-states would become very influential in the formation of Western culture. Now, how the Persians managed to increase the speed at which goods and ideas moved can be traced to several policies that facilitated communication and trade throughout their empire. So as far as trade goes, the Persians were one of the first cultures to use stamped coins as money. They also partially put into place standard weights and measures, so people could use the same type of money and units of measurement in many different areas of the Persian Empire. Having these standard units helped make trade a lot easier. It makes sense, right? Because this standardization made it possible for merchants to understand what the different quantities and prices were in each of the different places where they were trading. And the Persians also built roads. Although they were originally built to help move military troops quickly, the roads also made travel and trade easier throughout the empire. And related to my second point, the roads also made communication easier. You see, news could travel much faster along the roads, and so the Persian king had a constant stream of messengers bringing information to and from the capital and the outer edges of the empire. Communication was also facilitated by the eventual dominance of one language as the primary language of the empire. The diverse people within the empire spoke their own languages, of course, but many also knew and used the primary language. With the same language spoken and understood across such a large territory, it made the spread of ideas much faster.
Example question 6. Listening passage B. Page 301. Listen to part of a lecture in a psychology class.
While we're on the subject of depression, I'd like to discuss a condition called seasonal affective disorder, or SAD. That spells sad, and as you'll see, it's a very appropriate term for the condition. It generally occurs in the fall and winter, but then it tends to disappear when spring comes. It can be relatively mild, or severe enough that the sufferer becomes dangerously depressed. The cause seems to be a lack of light during the late fall and winter months. The evidence for this is that SAD occurs during the darker months of the year, and it is more common at higher latitudes like Alaska or Norway. It's almost unknown in sunny tropical climates. And the final piece of evidence is the effectiveness of phototherapy as a treatment, which I'll get to in a moment. So, it's believed that light holds down the production of a specific chemical in our bodies. On the other hand, this naturally occurring chemical increases during the times of year when there is less light, which is what triggers the symptoms of depression in SAD. We don't know the exact mechanism, but some treatments can often greatly reduce the symptoms. One treatment, called phototherapy, is to use a special kind of a light box in your home. Now, the light in this box is 10 to 20 times brighter than a regular lamp, and you keep the light turned on and pointed at you while sitting in front of it for a specific period of time. For most people, there are no side effects, but you may have to spend up to 2 hours a day in the light. Some studies indicate that certain medications can be just as effective as light therapy, but of course the side effects of some of these are often serious. And so you can see that we have established a cause for this type of depression and some rather effective ways to treat it. However, we are not so clear on the exact mechanisms that result in individual variations in the symptoms and in the responses to the treatments.
Speaking exercise 16. Number 1. Page 303. Listen to the lecture and take notes in the space provided for you below.
Two different approaches a government can take toward reducing pollution are setting limits on how much of a specific pollutant, like smoke or chemical waste, a company, a factory, or a machine is allowed to emit into the air or water. Or the government can charge a company for the amount of pollutant it emits, essentially taxing the company. Now, as for the first approach, limiting a pollutant allows a government to ensure that a pollutant is not emitted above a safe level, according to a standard that the government can determine based on studies. This means that the government has direct control over the final amount of a pollutant that gets into the atmosphere. However, this is also a disadvantage because once the limit is set, there's no motivation for a company to invest in anything that could reduce the pollutant below the established amount. So, even if new techniques or technology come along that could reduce a pollutant even more, companies won't be likely to invest in them, but instead will keep emitting as much of a pollutant as they are legally permitted to. Now, one of the biggest advantages the other approach, a tax on a pollutant, has over setting limits is that there's a reward for reducing the pollutant beyond the established limit. What I mean is that a company is rewarded for every reduction in the amount of the pollutant by paying less tax. And the closer it gets to zero emissions of a pollutant, the closer it gets to paying no tax at all. On the other hand, with a tax, the government does not have direct control over the amount of a pollutant emitted. If the tax is cheaper than the cost of reducing a pollutant, companies might simply choose to pay the tax and continue polluting. If the tax is too high, it might force the companies out of business instead of getting them to reduce pollutants. So you see, it's quite difficult to establish limits or determine the amount of tax that will ultimately get the results the government wants.
Number 2. Page 304. Listen to the lecture and take notes in the space provided for you below.
Today we're going to talk about creative problem solving. Now, since defining creativity is difficult, experts try to list the characteristics that are parts of it instead. Although there is not complete agreement, two characteristics, originality and appropriateness, are widely accepted as being essential parts. Now, if you need a creative solution to a problem, what you want isn't the normal, everyday solution that everyone else comes up with. And it cannot be something that people won't accept or that doesn't work in a certain environment or even something that requires technology that doesn't exist yet. In other words, it must be original and appropriate. So let's take the invention of the smartphone as an example. Even though most of its functions, calling, emailing, organizing photos, could be performed by some device or another at the time, no one had integrated these functions. No one had designed an interface like smartphones have. And there was a need for phones to function like mobile computers, as well as for the advanced technology. And finally, there was enough data transmission speed and computing power to make smartphones possible. They were, in other words, original and appropriate. Now let's look at an example of a solution created by Henry Ford of the Ford Motor Company in the early 20th century, Ford wanted to have his own supply of rubber that he needed to build his cars. So he decided to construct a rubber plantation in the jungles of Brazil called Fordlandia. It's certainly an original idea, but he had enormous labor problems. And the jungle was the perfect place for diseases and insects that destroy rubber trees. In other words, his solution to the need for rubber to produce cars was not appropriate for his employees or the environment of the jungle. In fact, Fordlandia was eventually abandoned without ever producing a drop of the substance that could be made into rubber and used on a Ford automobile.
Number 3. Page 304. Listen to the lecture and take notes in the space provided for you below.
Polynesians are the people who inhabit the islands that are scattered over 70 million square miles of Pacific Ocean in an enormous triangle from New Zealand in the southwest, Easter Island in the southeast, and Hawaii in the north. Until recently, evidence was pointing toward a rather clear picture of where the Polynesian people originally came from. The traditional theory claims that the people whose descendants became the Polynesians left the island of Taiwan some 4,000 years ago and spread to the islands east of Australia by around 1000 BCE. It was at this time that the islands of Western Polynesia were reached by the first settlers. The theory, called the Lapita-only hypothesis, says that only these people, the Lapita people, then spread out to all of the Polynesian islands. This theory is based on linguistic and archaeological evidence and some further DNA evidence. Linguists, who study language, can compare words in the Polynesian family of languages, such as Hawaiian or Tahitian, and look for similarities in Southeast Asian languages, and thereby follow these languages back in time to their origin. Similarities in the languages indicate that the earliest form of the Polynesian languages originated in Taiwan. Now, the archaeological evidence includes a style of ancient pottery called lapita. Thus, we call the people who created this pottery the Lapita as well. These ceramic pots and bowls, with their beautifully detailed designs, were among the first archaeological evidence discovered on the islands of Western Polynesia, where the Great Colonization began. This would indicate that the Lapita people who created the pottery were the first to make their home on the islands. Okay, so here's where some new genetic evidence conflicts with the traditional theory. We can use mitochondrial DNA, called mtDNA, to trace the origin of a people's DNA back in time to different populations. The mtDNA evidence indicates that people first arrived on the islands east of Australia some 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, not from the island of Taiwan at all, but from the mainland of Southeastern Asia. This new evidence does not ignore or cancel out the linguistic and archaeological evidence for the theory, but it does make it clear that the long-accepted theory is going to have to be altered to include the new genetic evidence.